We should try to reverse engineer the life we want. From my standpoint as a scientist who has studied world-class achievers,
how can we have large goals but not have extreme perfectionism and stress and overwhelm?
The life advice that applies at any age.
How can we think more effectively so we can have that final outcome that we want?
This is a blueprint for all human behavior. Everything can be traced back to...
Welcome to She Persisted, the Gen Z mental health podcast. I'm your host, Sadie Sutton. Let's get into it. Hello, and welcome back to She Persisted. I am so happy you are here for this episode because this is probably the greatest episode we've released thus far. Top 3 podcast guests I've dreamed of, and I literally wrote my early decision application to Penn about this guest, and I fought tooth and nail to take this class all 4 years at Penn. Took it my senior year. It truly changed my life, and I think this conversation will do the exact same thing for you. So many of us in Gen Z are incredibly ambitious. We have really big goals for ourselves. Almost 80% of Gen Z believe that they will get to where they want to be in life, which is significantly higher than both the general public and millennials. But there is so much more to being a high achiever, reaching success than just setting a goal. And so a lot of us are left wondering, how do we turn those beliefs and goals into reality? By the end of this episode, you're going to learn exactly how you can use psychology to become successful in your field and achieve those goals you've set. These skills will serve you well in any stage of life, especially if you're just starting your career or figuring out your passions in high school and college. So without further ado, let's dive into this episode featuring Dr. Angela Duckworth, a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, the #1 New York Times bestselling author of Grit, a 2013 MacArthur Genius Grant Fellow, a world-renowned speaker whose TED Talk has been viewed over 16 million times, and the expert in using grit to achieve your long-term goals. And soon you will be too. Angela Duckworth, welcome to She Persisted.
I'm so excited to be with you, Sadie.
This has been 5 years in the making. I was just telling you that I wrote my early decision essay about Penn, being I'm so excited about this research happening, reading Grit in high school, changed my life.
And you persisted.
Which is wild. I did.
I think I have the She Persisted quote somewhere on my bookshelf.
It's amazing. It's one of my favorites. And my dad saw it on a t-shirt when I was going through mental health treatment, and he was like, this just reminds me of you and what you're going through, you keep persisting. And then when I wanted to start the podcast, I was like, it's meant to be.
Well, as you know, I think your dad is very gritty.
It's true. Speaking of grit, we're going to do a kind of all-encompassing psychology of effort conversation today, as I've heard you kind of describe these concepts and topics, and especially in the context of Gen Z, but trying to develop it and understand it and the ways that we can think about these concepts and mechanisms to give ourselves the best chance of thriving. So I'm wondering if you can ground us a little bit in all these pop psychology verbs that we have and misuse in our day-to-day life. We are going to talk about grit. We're going to talk about self-control. Motivation can play into that. Before we dive into the 3 boxes model and how all these things fit into those areas, can you give us just some a basic framework, what those definitions are and what they aren't, and how we understand the psychology of effort?
Yeah, well, Sadie, I should say that when I started graduate school, all the verbiage, all the vocabulary was really, beyond me, because I don't know if I ever took psychology as an undergraduate. Maybe I did take one class and I did have a job in a psychology lab, but really what is even motivation? That was something I didn't have an experience with. I was 32. I had come out of classroom teaching math to high school students, and for 1 year, that was very long, to middle school students, kids going through puberty, trying to learn algebra. But all of that did give me these questions. I didn't have the language, but I did have questions. I wanted to know why some kids, but just why some people were so much more successful than other people, when it wasn't immediately apparent that they were, leagues smarter, right? So it's okay, something is missing here. That led me to motivation, right? I didn't know exactly what to call it, but effort, motivation. I think in terms of the words that you just named, now I can say, since I did go to graduate school, and I came to appreciate some of the nuances, right? And I think that's maybe one of the things I love about your podcast. You're trying to get one level or more deeper than bumper stickers. And I think that's really helpful for actually making this science actionable in your life. Self-control refers very specifically to the dilemma that we all face on a kind of hourly basis, which is there's something you can do that makes you feel really good right away, but there is something else that you could do that would make you feel even better, but not right away. So, for example, even reading a book, right, which, as you know, reading is down, right, across all age groups, including yours. And one reason is that actually reading does make you feel good, and it makes you feel good, especially in the long run, because I think it gives you ideas and thoughts and insights that maybe you can't get any other way. However, there is something else that you can do that is easier and, frankly, maybe in the moment a little more enjoyable, which is like go on your phone and, like, find the most, well, you don't even have to find it. It just gets served up to you, like whatever colorful, clever, usually funny, musical, whatever video. So that's an example of a self-control dilemma. But what you choose to eat, like whether you should get up off the couch and actually start going to bed versus like stay up for a couple more minutes. There are all these dilemmas. That's self-control, the ability to resolve those dilemmas in the favor of your future self and not just your present self. Motivation is more generally kind of like wanting to do things. So motivation is, I'm motivated to go to graduate school. I am motivated to get up off the couch and go to bed. But you know what? Motivation can also be like, oh, I'm motivated to watch the next cat video. So motivation doesn't always mean like, oh, for your long-term self. It's like an umbrella term for things that we want, for the processes of wanting and so forth. And then finally, I think just to clarify the definition of one term that I'm familiar with, grit. So grit is a particular kind of motivation. It's not the same thing as self-control. Self-control is like, ooh, I know this is going to be better for me even 5 minutes from now. I mean, how many of us have eaten something and like 5 minutes later you're like, definitely shouldn't have eaten that. With grit, it's really about very long-term goals. So the time scale of grit is months, years, decades, and to some extent a lifetime. It's pursuing goals over extremely long time frames with devotion, with passion, and then also with perseverance. So the enemies of grit are not momentary temptation. The enemies of grit are not knowing what you want to do with your life and also not being able to be resilient in the face of setbacks.
One way that you framed these processes with like self-control and what we're motivated towards and like how gritty we are, what our interests are in, was the 3 boxes model or the process model. And I think it's a really helpful way for us to understand at what point we can improve our grit or our self-control or our general motivation. And I think if we all understood the 3 boxes model, we'd be so much better off.
It would be so life-changing. Okay, so I want to tell you about the 3 boxes model by kind of continuing my story. So I'd been a classroom teacher and sundry other things for about a decade. I go to graduate school. I'm, learning the vocabulary. I'm like, oh, I guess I want to study motivation. I guess that's the word for it. And, start studying grit. And that was in 2002 that I went to graduate school. But in 2011, so that's 9 years later, I had finished my PhD. I guess I was an assistant professor. So I was a young professor or, rookie professor. And I go to this meeting at Yale. And I remember it was a cold November day. And I am, past the agenda, which, a piece of paper about the size of this. And at the top of it was the theme of the conference. There were about maybe a dozen or 24 scientists, and we all studied aspects of motivation or goal pursuit. And at the top of the agenda was the simplest question: how do we change? It was like in italics, like, how do we change? And at that event, at that meeting, it was kind of like a talent show or a show and tell, I guess. It's like every professor got up and said what they, maybe you say it's like a TED conference, right? Like you kind of said your piece, right? This is what I think. And the very first talk on the agenda was a Stanford professor, maybe like the world expert, certainly a world expert in emotion and emotion regulation. His name was James Gross. And he puts up this PowerPoint slide. And he says, everyone knows that emotions are really hard to manage. And I'm thinking to myself, like, oh my gosh, I have such a bad temper. Like, that is the emotion I struggle with. And he said, we all know what it's like to try to like suppress an emotion. And we all know how, badly that usually turns out. And I'm thinking to myself, yep, it almost never works for me. I like find it very hard. It's like I feel like the horses have left the barn when I lose my temper, especially honestly with like my my husband or like my kids. So he says, like, but if you really understand where emotions come from, then you can be much more effective in managing them. And he puts up this boxes and arrow diagram. And I'll simplify because I call it 3 boxes. If you like do the whole thing, there's like more boxes and arrows. But let's just say that there are 3 boxes. And the last box is how you respond to your situation, like with anger, with fear, with anxiety, with sadness. It also includes like actions, like I pick up the cup, I put down the cup, I eat the ice cream, I go for the run. So the box 3 in these 3 boxes is your response to your situation, right? And he was like, most people, when they, feel like they're getting really mad, just try to like not be mad. When they feel like they're lazy, they just try not to be lazy. When they feel like they want to eat ice cream, they just try not to eat the ice cream. He's like, okay, you can use willpower. You can use brute force willpower. But what if you understood what happened before box 3? And then he points to the box before that. He's like, box 2 is your thoughts. It's like how you make meaning of your situation, like what's going on here, right? And it's all in your head. So you're like, oh, hey, cat video, or like, wow, I, hate my brother-in-law. Like whatever it is that's in your box 2 sort of sets up box 3. So for me, I realized after many more hours of thinking about it than I had at that one conference in November 2011, is that when I get really mad, I think that what goes through box 2 for me, my thought is that my rights are being violated, that I'm not being appreciated, right? So when I actually trace back, like when I've really lost my temper with my kids or my husband, it's because I feel like I have been like a saint and I have not been appreciated, right? So I'm thinking to myself like, wow, this is pretty revolutionary. And by the way, Sadie, as you well know, like a lot of therapy is about changing box 2 thoughts, right? It's like, wait, why are you feeling that way? Like, why do you not want to get out of bed? Or why do you lose your temper? But James wasn't done yet because there was another box on the screen. And he said, but where do our thoughts come from, right? Obviously, we have schemas, we have like habits and our mindsets. He's like, but really what you want to think about is that every response and every thought about, that leads to starts in a situation. Like, where are you? And, I looked around and I was like, well, I'm in a darkened amphitheater with a lot of other professors. That is a certain kind of situation. Box 1 is your situation. So where am I right before I have the thought that I'm not being appreciated? And I remembered this one time that I really lost my temper with my husband, Jason. So box 3 was losing my temper, like really losing I won't describe it because it's embarrassing. And then box 2 was this thought of some version of like, hey, you don't appreciate me. Like, do you see how hard I'm trying? Like, I'm a saint. And box 1 was he had come home late and I had made dinner and it had gone cold and he hadn't called. And I thought to myself like, well, yeah, but I can't change that situation, right? Like that happened. So why are you emphasizing in this talk that if you want to control your emotions and control your behavior, you should go all the way to box 1? Like, I was like, I can't change that. But as James continued speaking, it became clear to me that like maybe that night I couldn't change that situation, but I could change it in the future, right? I could actually, for example, at that time, Jason and I were both working very hard. I could, for example, like at the end of my day, like literally pick him up to go home for dinner, right? So now we're in a situation where we're like just together. I could actually change box 1 by making dinner together, right? Like, imagine that. So I guess I'll say this, Sadie. I think the 3 boxes model, situation is box 1, thoughts are box 2, your response is box 3. I have come to believe that this is a blueprint for all human behavior. Everything we do, everything we say, and every feeling we have can be traced back to this kind of situation that leads to the thought, that leads to response. And when I teach my classes now, I say like we should try to reverse engineer the life we want, and instead of using willpower or even just like change your mindset and your attitude, which of course we should try to do, we should set ourselves up for success. We should set ourselves up to be our best selves by putting ourselves in situations and creating situations that naturally in a way bring out our best.
So I want to go through these different concepts that you've researched so extensively and talk about how we can set ourselves up for success, whether it's those contexts we put ourselves in, maybe it's to some degree the thoughts that we have. One of my favorite like self-control things you taught us was like, imagine yourself in a movie and watch yourself doing the thing. Like the fact that it actually impacts our outcomes is crazy. So starting with self-control, because I think that is what gets most confused with grit. And this is why I loved taking that class, because I was like, I am someone with self-control, with like not being on TikTok, or like would never run a marathon, but I'm like, I am really gritty in some areas, and understanding that those are really different, and I can be gritty and not like the most self-controlled person. You have so much more grace and compassion for yourself, and then you're more motivated. Like, again, the way we think about it has such an impact. And I think also because of how we use like grit colloquially as like white knuckling through a shitty situation, and like just be more gritty, try harder. And so I'm curious if we start with self-control, so we really understand how that's different from grit. What are the contexts we should put ourselves in? How can we think more effectively so we can have that like final outcome that we want?
When I started researching grit, I mean, I did the very simple thing. You don't need any statistics for it. You just like talk to people, right? Interview them. I would interview very successful people, right? So Olympic athlete or the equivalent. So
not me.
Well, you know,
not that box.
Not yet. Okay, maybe not in
not ever.
Maybe not in athletics, but maybe in something else.
Yeah, if they
right?
need to like write an essay,
you know,
sure, gotcha.
Exactly, right? Like, so when I started interviewing these super achievers, I found this kind of through line of, you know, they did put in a lot of effort, right? But what I didn't find is them saying like, I force myself to do it. Like, I hate my job, but I, you know, white knuckle my way through. Yeah. They actually used words like love, like passion, devotion. More than one said, you know, I don't understand what people mean by work. To me, it's all play.
Yeah.
Now, of course, if the conversation were long enough, they would talk about the parts of their jobs that were tedious, right? You know, there aren't many professors that I know who love to sit through faculty meetings, right? And I'm sure when you have to, you know, whatever, edit a video, you know, well, maybe you love it, but there's got to be some things that you don't love. The only person I ever interviewed who couldn't think of anything that he didn't truly love at all was Will Shorts, the editor of the crossword puzzle for the New York Times, and now like, you know, the Wordle and the puzzle pages. And I was like, come on, there's got to be something. And he was like, well, maybe laying out the crossword puzzle. But then he like paused a beat and he was like, no, that's actually kind of fun too. So the through line was really love. The through line was passion, right? Now that automatically, I mean, right there sets you up for a distinction between grit and self-control. I mean, I need self-control to floss my teeth. I do not love flossing my teeth, right? I need self-control to do my physical therapy exercises because I have a hypermobile SI joint, and it's like, you know, basically it's like quite literally having a pain in your butt. It's like, okay, well, I have to do these. They're just not fun. They're not anything I find interesting or enjoyable. I mean, not that hard, but like for 30 minutes a day, I'm supposed to like, you know, like stretch my piriformis muscle and like, you know, work my hip flexor. So I would say that self-control is about doing the things that you have to do because it's better for your long-term self. I mean, I will just be healthier. I mean, it will drive me crazy if I can't walk without pain. So that's a self-control, you know, dimension of my life that I think anybody can recognize. And there's nobody on the planet who doesn't need self-control, because there are things that are more fun than physical therapy or, you know, for me, like sitting through a faculty meeting. But grit in these interviews just had a very different portrait. And in fact, when I continued the conversation with many of these paragons of grit, right, who exemplified passion and perseverance for long-term goals, I got to tell you, Sadie, more than a few actually brought up mental health issues with unbidden, right? I mean, it wasn't really like, I'm not clinically trained, so I wasn't asking about things like that. But, you know, some would say, oh, by the way, I have a diagnosis of ADHD, you know, and I never outgrew it like some people do. Like, I find it very difficult to rein in my impulses, to force myself to pay attention to things that I don't find intrinsically interesting. And so right there I had evidence anecdotally, but I think really convincingly, that you can be gritty but not super high in self-control in the conventional sense. So I think that the life advice that comes from that is that, you know, if grit is about having passion and perseverance for long-term goals, but not like fighting, you know, the hourly temptations, then any of us can have grit regardless of how much, you know, executive function or willpower we have, because you can, first of all, set up your situation so that you're not faced with temptations, which a lot of these paragons of grit said, but also we can set our life situation so that we're doing things that we love, right? I have to say that I don't have to use a lot of willpower in my everyday life because I love teaching, you know, I love students like you. I love reading these books, right? Like, including Marie Kondo, which, by the way, has a lot of psychological wisdom. But I think that, to me, has like such a profound kind of like, oh, right. How do I set up my life, my situation such that I'm doing things that I have passion for intrinsically, and that also, that remove temptation. So I'm not like constantly using my self-control muscle.
Before we talk about growing grit and establishing like what you are gritty in respect to, especially as a young adult, last thing on self-control, if you have like a student listening and they're like, I hate this class, but for this larger goal of what I want to do in my career, like I need an A, or this is like a core requirement that has to be done. If you're giving them like a handful of tips they can apply to short-term have that self-control and get through the things that we have to do to understand the long-term goals, what are those tips?
So tip number 1, don't ever say to yourself, I got to try harder. It never works. It really doesn't. Research is definitive. It's only tiring to make yourself try harder. It's the most intuitive thing, by the way. It's the thing that people say that, oh, I didn't meet my New Year's resolutions. I stayed up too late last night. Tomorrow I've got to try harder, right? But it is the least effective and it is the most exhausting. So tip number 1 is if you ever hear your self-talk like, God, I got to try harder in this class. It's like, that's not going to work, okay? All right, so now if that's a don't, you need to do. So tip number 2 would be if you can put yourself physically in a situation, and I emphasize the physical. So put yourself in a physical situation that makes concentrating, working hard, and so forth easier. Okay, I'll give you a specific example. In college, I had to take this class on ancient Chinese pottery. It was like pottery from the Bronze Age in China, which I was just like, if I see another 3-legged urn, I'm just gonna vomit. But that's all it was. It was like darkened auditorium. Can you imagine how it's like darkened auditorium? It was after lunch.
Oh no.
And he puts up the slides. I mean, apparently
not context for success.
I mean, like everybody was like falling asleep, and that included me because I'm sure it was interesting to other people. It wasn't interesting to me. And so I was thinking to myself, like, how am I going to make it through this class, right? So I deliberately chose to sit in the very front row, right? I was maybe like as far away from the professor as you are from me. And I'll tell you, it's really hard to fall asleep, like when you're, sitting within arm's reach of your professor. He was also louder. He was very soft-spoken, but from the front row, I could actually hear him, right? He didn't wear microphones. I was just like, okay, so I've got him.
360 degrees.
Yeah, I was like, I was there. By the way, I was like the only kid in the front row because, of course, everybody was in the back sleeping. So I think if you can think to yourself, where do I want to put myself physically? And when I say this to students, I don't exaggerate. Sit in the front row of every one of your classes, like every single one. And don't tell me there aren't seats in the front row. They're all empty, right? And I think that sort of goes, beyond like where you sit in class. Well, like where do you study, right? You have to figure out what works for you. I think for some students, like studying in a really noisy place like Starbucks is actually better for them, like the white noise of just like things going on. For other students, it's the library. I always fell asleep in the library, so that wasn't for me. But you have to think about all these things tactically. Like if you were going to set yourself up for success, like physically, where would you be? So that would be number 2. And the third point is, the other aspect of your situation, which we haven't talked about yet, but is maybe the most powerful, is the social aspect of your situation, right? So if you just audit your friendships, like, do you want to be like your friends? If the answer is yes, awesome, you have found your tribe, right? So I want to use this story of this 10th grade sophomore in high school who was being interviewed. Like I was interviewing her and then a younger kid from the same school. So it was like a 10th grader and maybe a 5th grader. I think you want to set yourself up because sometimes socially we haven't set ourselves up for success. So the 10th grader is giving advice to the 5th grader, and in all her years, I think she must have been like 15 or 16 years old. She's like, if I knew
when
now.
I was your age.
Yeah, she was like, when I was your age, if I knew then what I know now.
Day.
She's like shaking her head, like she's a million years old, and she was like, I would have chosen my friends differently because you start to act like your friends, you start to talk like your friends, you start to dress like your friends, you keep up. She was like, I got into the wrong crowd, right, and it really took me off track for a few years, and then I righted the course, and basically, I think that we can set ourselves up for success when we put ourselves in social situations. I think who your friends are, who you hang out with, who you room with, and then mentors. And if I could just say, Sadie, that the life advice that applies at any age, and I really mean it, including at my age, is like find a mentor. A mentor is somebody who's a few steps farther down the path, who can turn back and lend you a hand, don't walk over there. Like it's really rocky.
Yeah.
And so I have benefited from mentors at your age, earlier than your age, and at my age now. And I think when I, think about this guy, James Gross, who I met at that conference in 2011, he immediately became a mentor. He was farther down the academic path. He was a full professor, and he continues to be, one of the people I turn to when I need advice. And if I didn't have that advice, if I weren't in that social situation, I don't think I would be here.
Yeah. What if we're not gritty? What if we don't have self-control? We take the scale, or it's like, I don't know if it's
terrified.
0 or
like,
1,
oh, no.
but people are listening, you're like, that's not me that you're describing.
I'm not a hard worker. I don't finish whatever I begin.
Yeah. Or like I remember in class, everyone raised their hands for where they fell on the grit scale. Not everyone was like 100%
I think I gave you
them.
guys like a sort of a stage model where I was like stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 6 is like, I have a calling, like come back in 20 years, I'll be doing the same thing.
So what if people are listening and they're like, I want to do
Sounds
something
great.
that I love. Like I want to have more self-control for those day-to-day things that I have to do, but I wouldn't say that this idea of grit or high self-control describes me currently.
Yeah.
Is it a death sentence? Is it like going to be horrible?
Should you just,
Should
call
we
it
give
in?
up now? Like, what do we do?
So let's take grit in particular, because I think you've done a good job of helping me, share the nuances between these two things. So let's just take grit, because I think most people who come to talk to me and ask me for advice are sort of more interested in wanting to have more grit, right? And let's take passion in particular, because when I collect data on the grit scale, when I look at the scores, there's 2 subscores. You get a passion subscore. That's, how devoted you are to something over time. And there's a perseverance subscore, which is how hardworking and resilient you are. And every time I've given the grit scale, on average, perseverance scores are higher than passion scores. In other words, people find it, maybe more intuitive or easier to work hard, to be resilient. But what do I work on, right? I mean, that's the usual question for people. And I think when it comes to like finding that calling, right, developing that passion, the advice I have is that you have to actually move like a paramecium, right? In other words, like you have to move gradually towards things that are more energizing and away from things that are less energizing. So paramecium, if you recall from your whatever 8th grade bio or something, is a single-celled organism. It doesn't even have a brain.
I thought we were talking about like a Greek mythology character.
No, paramecium, there probably are lots of them actually.
This shows you how I do not go towards biology. That's not exciting for me. We've gone away.
That was my major actually. I was a bio major. I come from a family of scientists and
I
doctors.
followed the advice.
Okay. Well, that's okay. Well, you can be a paramecium, single-celled organism. Okay. It's like one of those things that you did learn about. I am 100% sure. It like you can swim as a paramecium does, like towards the things that give you warmth and sort of nurturance, right? Like they give you life. So for me, what it means to steer like a paramecium was to steer towards psychology, right? Like I was a bio major, but I started to steer away from like molecular biology or genetics, and I started steering toward like the psychology of motivation. So and I got more joy out of it. I got more warmth. So if you don't yet have a calling, if you're like, wow, I don't yet have passion for long-term goals, I would say steer like a paramecium. Just like don't overthink it. A paramecium doesn't even have a brain. It just is sort of like, oh, it's warm over here. Like I find there's food over here. So do that. Do things that give you energy. Just this morning, I was talking to a student named Nick, who I taught now a few years ago, and he's figuring out what he wants to do, and I can see him steering. And I asked him, what gives you energy? I was like, what gives you that kind of feeling of like life force, right? And he was like, I love reading. I love talking to people about ideas. But I was like, what do you find tiring? He was like, well, I had this job at a startup, and I had to do a lot of project management. And I had to look through things and write an email to my boss about like where, by the way, some of the things that I think you're very good. He's like, where we should do media spend. He was like, I hated trying to optimize our social media strategy.
I'm like, love it.
I was like,
swimming towards.
I was like, I know someone who wants to steer toward that. So, be a paramecium, move gradually towards things that you like, move away from the things that are exhausting to you. And, one day you will find that you have steered yourself, I think, into a calling, but don't expect it to happen overnight.
Yeah. So shifting gears a little bit, we have a lot of really interesting data coming out about Gen Z. We know that Gen Z is a really ambitious generation. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a lot of large goals But there's also a lot of pressure, which is what we hear from a lot of college students, but also now like high schoolers, middle schoolers. I'm a TA for Grit this semester, and you're hearing that from them. A lot of pressure that they put on themselves, that they feel from the context that they're in. And I think with Grit, you see that exemplified in world-class achievers and these people who have really thrived. And so when we're aspiring to that, it can be tough when you haven't figured this out. It's not fitting perfectly into your life. Harvard said that now college kids 18 to 25 have double rates of depression and anxiety compared to teens. Perfectionism skyrocketed in college students. People reporting that they feel pressure to meet unrealistic expectations. The flourishing data just came out for the first time. Our curve is collapsing.
Yeah.
And like one potential reason is that there is this long-term consequences of being really focused on like status and power, which I don't necessarily think has to be synonymous with grit, but when we think of like high achievers, we can kind of fit it into those buckets. And so I'm curious, because it doesn't have to be the way we think of things. How can we have large goals and want to follow these areas that we're gritty in, but not have this extreme perfectionism and stress and overwhelm
and exhaustion?
Yeah.
I first of all want to go on record and say that I think a life of trying, a life of striving, and a life of effort is good, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not going to walk away from that. And when I look at the happiest people, so I told you that I started off as a psychologist when I began my PhD interviewing successful people. But also when I interview people who are successful, I have to say they tend to be very happy, right? They're not like miserable and successful, which actually Freud thought that there was a kind of like wrecked by success, idea. He had some clients who would come into his office and I guess lay down on his couch, and Sigmund Freud thought like, oh wow, there are all these like high achievers who are miserable. I think you will find them, but as a rule, I find that people who are CEOs of companies and artists who are, thriving, and musicians and community activists, it's like, the ones who are working really, really hard on average are actually happier, because when you burn out and you're exhausted, you're no longer, in the game. So I first want to go on record and say, I think a life of trying, is a wonderful life. But how do you do it in a way that is joyful, that is sustainable? Like there is absolutely, I think, if there's anybody who doubts these trends, I think they are living in a fantasy world. Young people are struggling, and I don't think it's anything like inherently wrong with them. So what's going on? I do think it's more complicated than, it's just social media. I think it's more complicated than it's just screens, which of course includes more than social media, right? Like I don't think we can blame this all on YouTube videos or Instagram. I do think there are a lot of forces that are, as you say, putting pressure on young people.
And ourselves too. It's not just external. There's a lot of like internal pressure we place too.
And I think that internal pressure is sort of coming. I mean, you're just born as a baby, right? So like, where is this internal pressure coming from, right? So you're kind of maybe getting caught up. I remember when my daughters, we moved from the suburbs to the center of Philadelphia. And when we did, they started going to this school that actually had all these, like, as you put it, ambitious, goal-directed kids, right? And they started, like, even in 5th and 6th grade, coming home, like, stressed about what college they would get, like their reach school. I was like,
hello?
Your reach school? I was like, where did you learn that? They had this now clear idea of the rank order of GPA and whether they'd be on honor society. And, when I say that there's this internalization, I do think it comes from external. So, for example, in their school, which I liked their school in many ways, but I didn't like it in all ways. They had this honor society, and all the kids would be forced to like go to the auditorium, and then the kids in the honor society, which is of course a small fraction of kids, they would be on stage, and everybody else would have to sit through this long program where like one by one, the kids in the honor society got to like stand up, and like at the end, I kid you not, the teacher who was in charge of this was like, basically, what's wrong with the rest of you? She gets up to the podium. She's like, well, congratulations to the Honor Society. And she like looks out at this auditorium of kids and she was like, and the rest of you just got to start working. And I was like, oh my gosh. Right? By the way, Sadie, this is a magnet school. This was like the top performing school in the city of Philadelphia and the state of Pennsylvania. All those kids were honors kids. But like, what are you doing? So I think this internalization of the kind of like, you're late, you've missed the boat, you're not good enough, you're not perfect enough, you don't have the perfect extracurricular, resume. I think a lot of it is actually of this cultural moment. And I have a lot of sympathy. I can't even say empathy because I didn't really grow up with it, but I have a lot of sympathy for the kids who are in Gen Z. What do we do, right? If it's a complex cocktail of forces and it's not just screens and it's not just social media, although I do think those contribute. I think that, one thing to like just say from my standpoint as a scientist who has studied world-class achievers is that early in life, you do not find them white-knuckling it or even frankly working in a very consistent direction toward anything. They're playing. They're like, oh, I think I'll go out for track this year. And then discovering that they don't like track, and then the next year doing like a different sport, or maybe, if you want to use yourself as a person, Emily, going in a totally different direction than
we went a different direction after.
Did we? Okay,
we did.
Good.
We tried it though.
You're able to walk,
yeah.
Like you're sampling, and that is the term that scientists use. You're sampling. So sampling means trying things out in a more casual, friendly way than in a sort of determined, serious way. And sampling precedes specialization. That is the paradox, right? So that, if you want to be someone who in their 50s or 40s or, even like in their 30s is an expert or an expert in training and is dedicated and gritty, then early on you actually have to relax a little. And I'm not saying you should quit things in the middle. I don't think that kids should be taught the lesson that like, oh, it's effortful, like don't go to practice tomorrow, or like, my daughter did track too, and this is the younger one, Lucy, and I think it was like her first track meet. She comes back, like
track meets are horrible. Like they're so stressful.
Yeah, well, she discovered that. She was
like running up the bowls. Like it's crazy.
Well, she liked running, but then she was like, after not only the first meet, it was the first event, right? She comes around, like we're in the, the bleachers, and she's like, Mom, I don't want to track anymore. And I was like, that is totally fine. I get you. And then I said to her what was true. I was like, you can quit track at the end of the season. Mm-hmm. So she did have to finish what she started. But then she had, spent the whole season like thinking about what she was going to do next. And I thought that was great. So I just want to say to you, Sadie, like, when tiger moms, for lack of a better word, and tiger dads come to me for like pro tips on how to force their kids to like, play more piano, I say to them, like, does your child like piano, right? Like, does it give them energy? Whose decision was it to do piano? I think there needs to be more sampling, more play. There's so much to say about work ethic, but I think we've got it wrong when we have prematurely, sort of narrowed the world for kids. And I say that across the socioeconomic spectrum. I think some of the most privileged kids are the ones that are like most imprisoned by their parents' narrow views of what kids ought to be doing.
Yeah. You kind of talked about this, but having your environment be your ally and not your opponent is one philosophy that you share a lot. Mm-hmm. And also that gritty people would like maybe be in a track context or do an activity and they have this mindset that like, I'll show you, I can do this. But also you've said that like being in the challenging situation isn't enough to have that mindset, and that when we're not supported, but we are challenged, the end result isn't grit. So what happens when you're in that challenging situation, but you don't have that support piece?
The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who said, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Actually, I think it's usually like a what doesn't kill you, but I think in the German original, it's like what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. He, by the way, suffered from, among other things, I believe syphilis. So, he had a lot of challenges with his physical health, and I think maybe with his mental health as well. When he said that, and it became this catchphrase, right? Like Kelly Clarkson and Kanye West, and like, it's like songs about what doesn't kill me or what doesn't kill you makes you strong. Like it's suggestive, I think misleadingly, that what we really all need in life is just like a high dose of challenge. But, if you ask the question, like, well, when does it kill you? Sometimes it just kills you or maims you. So when, Friedrich Nietzsche, like when does it kill you and when does it not kill you? When does it make you stronger and when does it make you weaker? I think the missing element is support, as you said, right? I wanted my daughters to have challenge. I didn't want to raise two entitled, lazy, spoiled kids, and neither did my husband, Jason, who you know. And I think when Jason and I thought about it, we thought, well, we need to actually make sure that their childhoods include a lot of challenge and a ton of support, right? So I think you were over last night when Lucy called, right? When our kids call, we answer on the first ring. Like, it's not like, oh, let's not answer the phone when our kids need us. When my daughter says, hey, can you look at my resume and cover letter? Damn straight. And by the way, I make track changes, right? So I don't do their letters for them, but I make a ton of track changes. And if they send it to me again, I'll do it again. And if they want me to practice interviewing with them, I do it. I think they need a huge amount of support. I think kids do best when they are the center of the universe for their parents. Like, I think every child should go to bed at any age, and I include myself because my mom is still alive. She's 90. I want to feel like I am the center of the universe, that I am the most important thing in the world for my mom. And I know I was for my dad, up to the day that he passed. And I think that kind of support, it's unconditional. It's like, I got you. You know what I mean? Like, you're going through anxiety, I got you. You don't know how to answer an email because that was deeply unprofessional. I got you. At the same time, yes, challenge and sometimes, challenges that parents put into place, right? Like, hey, I'm going to sign you up for this hard thing. But I think the message is wrong when we think that, hey, what doesn't kill you always makes you stronger. I think what doesn't kill you because it is a challenge that you were supported through, I think that's what makes you stronger, and that's harder to make a song out of. But I think it's it's everything I like about the work you're doing at this podcast, for example.
You had a quote that says, it feels like cheating when the situation is helping us. And I want to talk about this, especially with respect to AI, because we've talked about this really fascinating split between how high schoolers and college students view AI. And I think this idea is true, right? Like, if the situation is easy or it's set up for success, you're like, I'm not doing it. You've talked about, like, we should stop DIYing things. Can you speak a little bit to that and kind of how those things play together, especially in the context of this age demographic who is earlier in their career trying to prove themselves, all the things?
This generation, I guess I should say your generation, right, has maybe been the first generation in human history to go through two completely world-changing innovations. One is the proliferation of the internet, right? So yeah, the internet was around before you were around, but like the ubiquity of, everybody having, for example, a phone in the palm of their hand. So that's one world-changing technological innovation. Another one is artificial intelligence, right? Which has also been around well before you were, but like not like this, right? When I say that, sometimes it feels like cheating to change your situation, to make things easier, I think AI is a really good example. So with AI, if I told you, Sadie, that I used AI to write this book, right? Mm-hmm. I think for a lot of people, it'd be like, ooh, like, don't tell anyone, right? But I will tell you truly that I have a commencement speech that's coming up for Bates College, and I started working on it. I knew what I wanted to write about, which is phones, which is, you could argue the first of the technological smartphones, obviously, the first of the two technological revolutions that you yourself personally are experiencing. And I was working on it when my husband and I were on vacation, and Jason had to take a call, and I was like, I'm just like sitting here, and we're on the beach. So I pulled out my phone. Obviously, I didn't have my laptop, but I had my phone with me. And I went on Claude, and I started having a conversation with Claude, and I, use this AI. Sometimes it knows who I am, so it's like not necessary to say things about like, my research and so forth. And, I asked Claude to draft me a speech for my commencement talk, and I gave Claude the gist of it. I also gave it some, and you know what? The first draft was not bad, but then it wasn't quite right. And I was like, oh, but Claude, you missed this, and, I want to emphasize this research that's coming out of Stanford. And of course, there's my own, so Claude made revision 2 and then revision 3. And so there was this dialogue between me and AI. And when we got to the end, I'll tell you. So Jason, who's very skeptical of technology, he sometimes calls himself like a neo-Luddite, right? Really skeptical, techno-skeptical, and AI skeptical. He was like, oh, what have you been doing? I was like, I wrote a commencement speech with AI on my phone. And he was like, oh, come on. And I was like, can I read it to you? And I read it to you, and his jaw dropped. He was like, it's really good. And I was like, yeah, I know. Now, who gets credit for that speech, right? Is it cheating to have used my phone and AI technology to write the speech, or is it not cheating? I can understand the perspective of someone who's like, oh, it's not fair, it's not you. I personally take the perspective that I was in charge of that conversation. I asked Claude to do certain things. I responded. By the way, I took the eventual speech, the sort of like last product, and then I put it into a Google Doc, and then I edited it, and I might go back to Claude and ask it for some more help. Can you make the sentence shorter? I personally feel like it's not cheating to use your situation to advantage. I think it's not cheating to make your environment your ally, and I think that includes AI. The difference is when you're not upfront about it, right? I'm not going to tell anyone like, oh, by the way, I wrote every word myself. I didn't use any technology.
Into stone.
Exactly.
No technology
Here,
at all.
I have a chisel to show you, right? That is cheating. I think if you turn in an essay for your college application and you have it, made up, and it's like about your personal experience, and you use AI to write something, and you also don't disclose it. I think in now the current world, what professors and teachers are doing is saying like, you have to cite it. You just have to like say like, I used it. But how different is it than using, a word processor or a typewriter even? So I think this idea that we shouldn't say that life is easy. We shouldn't say that we want to avoid effort for the right. But at the same time, we should say, how can I make this task as efficient as possible? Like, how can I use every tool? And I think this generation, I see it, that kids like you, frankly, who are very educated and are the center of their parents' universe and therefore have a huge leg up, you're using it, right? Yeah. Of course you're using it. The kids at Andover are using it. The kids in the Ivy League are using it. What I worry about, if I can bring up a topic that's now become controversial, but I think, kids with less opportunity, right? Like, I worry that they're not using it, right? Yeah. Like, I think it's going to drive a wedge between the haves and the have-nots if we don't proactively say to everyone, it's not cheating to use AI to get smarter. It's not cheating to use AI to produce a better speech if you can be upfront about what you did, and also if you can be an active partner in your relationship with AI.
I have some rapid fire questions to wrap things up. First, and these are partially AI, so we get to walk the walk.
Yes, exactly. Yay.
One book every Gen Z listener should read, other than Grit, of course.
It's a book by a journalist and writer, Calvin Trillin, who often writes for The New Yorker. And it is a love letter to his wife, and it's called About Alice. Why do I recommend it? I don't know. I think there are great life truths in there, and I'm a complete hopeless romantic. And my own daughters sometimes say, one day someone might love me the way Calvin loved Alice.
Aww. What is your favorite psychology study or finding?
I think my favorite finding is really the discovery of deliberate practice by Anders Ericsson. The idea that when you try to figure out like, how did they become an Olympian? Like, how does Usain Bolt run so fast? And how does Katie Ledecky swim like a fish? It ends up being this methodical, systematic, deliberate practice, honing in on one weakness at a time, practicing with complete concentration. And here's the most important part: getting feedback on what you can do differently, and then doing the whole thing again.
A quote you come back to often?
A quote that I come back to often. Well, I'll tell you a quote that I'll paraphrase. I read it a few years ago, but I texted it to my daughters, and we were recently retexting it to each other. It's a quote from a young woman who was dying, and she was in a conversation with her younger sister, and it was really towards the very end of her days. She died very early, so I think she was maybe your age, actually. And she said to her younger sister that the most exciting thing that was happening in her life, that she discovered how important it was to say honestly what she was thinking and how she was feeling.
You've done so many studies on self-control, grit, achievement. What is next? What are the next projects? What are you working on?
So Sadie, I have to tell you what I'm so excited about right now, but it's not going to be any surprise to you because you're helping me with this project. It's called Phones in Focus. And Phones in Focus is a survey. It lives at phonesinfocus.org. And as you know, any teacher or principal in the country, any educator, especially we're looking for educators at public schools, can go there and immediately make their voice heard on this urgent question of what should schools be doing on cell phones. And in particular, what we're looking for as scientists is a kind of census on what schools are doing, because nobody knows. It's crazy. there's legislation being passed, there's lots of commentary, but nobody knows what schools are doing. And the most important thing I think for educators is like at the very end of the survey, which only takes a few minutes, maybe 4 minutes to complete, you get an instant snapshot of how your school compares to other schools around the country because other educators' data are flowing in. So Phones in Focus is my passion. The last thing I want to end with is this image. So my mom is 90, I mentioned. She's an artist. And one day she said, oh, by the way, I'm working on a portrait of you. And I said, oh, amazing. And she said, it's the biggest work I've done, maybe ever, but it's certainly it's this huge canvas. I mean, it's like, I don't know, it doesn't even fit on this wall, for example, right? It's like enormous. It's like a life-size portrait of me. And she said, I'm going to show it to you when I'm done. And when she revealed it, it's a picture of me, and there's sort of all these art objects in the background. Like it's kind of like I'm a sculpture in a gallery. But then I noticed it's me looking down like this at my phone. And I said to her, I'm like, Mom, my portrait of me is me staring into like, a blue rectangle. And she was like, yeah. And I was like, but why would you paint that? She's like, because that's what you're always doing. Oh my God. That's what I see. So I am not above any of this. I think that this relationship that we all have with AI, with technology, with our phones is complicated. Apparently, I am not 100% aware of my own relationship with aforementioned technologies. But I think that it's urgent that we, bring a little psychological wisdom and a little insight. So I hope everyone, listens to the social media messages that you've crafted, and they, especially if they're educators, go to phonesinfocus.org and check it out.
Amazing. Thank you for coming on She Persisted.
Thank you. I'm glad you persisted, and I'm going to keep persisting myself.
Yay. If you enjoyed this episode of She Persisted, make sure to leave a review, subscribe, and share with a friend or family member. Follow along at She Persisted Podcast on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and more for bonus content. Thanks for listening, and keep persisting.